This is Code Along Exercise 4. In this Code Along exercise, we'll be adding a CSS floating grid system so that we can create layout in each of our site pages. To start off with, you're going to download the Code Along Exercise 4 zip file, and then I'm going to double click it to extract it. And then you're going to drag this folder to the location where you are keeping your other Code Along exercises. In this case, that's in my development folder. Then I'm going to go ahead and drag that folder to my code editor, which is Atom. Then we'll go ahead and double click to bring up the index page. And if you right click on the index file here, you can select Show in Finder. And then you can right click on the file to select Open with Google Chrome. To get started, we'd like to link to a CSS grid system. Now there's a lot of third-party grid systems that we could use online. In this case, I'm going to use one that I've pre-built myself. To get to the code, I'm going to open up a new tab in the browser, and I'm going to go to github.com/johngrover/css-light-grid. Next, I'm going to click on the CSS folder that's linked here in the center of the page. And then I'm going to click on the file name light-grid.css to reveal the code. Here you can click and drag to copy all of the code, and this will be from lines 1 to line 45 in the code. And then I'm going to copy it onto my clipboard. I'm using Command-C on Mac, or that would be Control-C on Windows. And then I'm going to jump back to Atom. And here we'd like to create a new CSS file to paste this code into. So I'm going to right click on the CSS folder and select New File. And here I'm going to call this grid.css. Here you can paste in your code. I'm using Command-V on Mac, or you can use Control-V on Windows to paste. Now this gives us a pretty good start, but we'd like to modify this a little bit. Now the first thing we'd like to change is we're going to remove this box sizing declaration that's on line 3. And the reason why is you might remember that previously in layout.css, we've already applied that code. So there's no need to repeat ourselves here in grid.css. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And another thing we'd like to change is that in the light grid that we copy and pasted from GitHub, the width here is set to 960, and we'd actually like our containers to be a little bit wider. So let's change the 960 to 980 instead. Additionally, we're also going to create another container class here, and this one we're going to call container-fluid, and we're going to set its width to 100%. Now this is going to give us the flexibility to have containers in our website that have a fixed pixel amount, as well as fluid containers that are going to stretch across the entirety of the screen. Now, one other subtle difference is that in this grid, they were setting the margin below each row. Now, instead of setting the margin below each row, we're going to delete that there, and we'll add the bottom margin onto the column class itself. So here I'll change this margin-left property to the margin property, and we'll set 0 for the top margin, 0 for the right margin, 2% for the bottom, and 2% for the left. Now normally we wouldn't put any background colors or foreground colors onto any of our grid classes because we don't really want our grid to show up. Most of the time our grid is acting as an invisible skeleton of our page layout. However, in this exercise, in order for us to temporarily see these elements, we're going to give them background colors for now. So here I'm going to set my container class to have a background of #EFEFEF. This is a hexadecimal color for light gray. And then I'm going to go down to my row class here, and I'm going to give this a background color of #CCC, which is a medium gray color. And then lastly, we're going to go down to our column class selector here, and we're going to set this with a background of the color aqua. So here we're just using the color name aqua. So let's go ahead and save grid.css, and then we can close out this file. Now we always have to remember that on our HTML pages, we're only linking to the main.css file. So if we want to make use of that grid.css file, we're going to have to import that in here into our main.css. And here we'll set it to import grid.css. So make sure you save the main.css file as well. Next, let's open up the index.html page. Now there's no one single strategy for creating page layout, But what I like to do to keep things organized is I usually start from the top of the page and work my way down, going from outer to inner on the elements. So starting at the very top of the page, I know that I want to visually have a bar that stretches 100% across the entirety of the screen. In a future exercise, we're going to add a background texture to this container. But for now, we're just going to create a box as a placeholder for it. So I'm going to create a div here with a class of container fluid. And then we're going to move the closing div here down below the header. And you can see that I've already properly indented the code for you. We can even put a comment to ourselves that this particular div is closing our container fluid class. So this bar is going to stretch 100% of the screen, and then inside of it, our header is going to stay centered and only 980 pixels wide. To do that, we're going to give our header a class of container. So we can go ahead and save that there. And let's go back to the browser and refresh and see what it looks like. So if I refresh the page there, we're now seeing our header is getting that gray background color because we've given that gray background to our class of container, and we can see that it's also now 980 pixels wide and it's centering in the middle of the screen. Next, we'd like to create a row element here to contain each of these two navs, which will act as columns. So here we'll create a div with a class of row, and we'll move the closing div here just below our two nav elements. And here we can give another comment that this is the closing of the row class. Now for each of these navs, we'd like to have them span exactly half of our 12 unit grid. So we're going to give each of these a class of column-6. Let's go ahead and save our index page and come back to the browser and refresh. Perfect. So since we've given the columns a background color of aqua, we can see each of those columns there that's spanning 6 of the 12 unit grid, and they have 2% margin space in between them. Next, let's move on to our main element here. Now, everything inside of our main element here, we would like to be centered in the middle of the screen, just as wide as the header element that's above them. So in order to accomplish this, we're going to give main a class of container as well. And if we save that and come back and refresh, you can see that it's now holding all of our content there into the center of the screen, just as wide as the header above. Next, we'll create a couple rows. So I'm going to start off with a div here with a class of row, and I'm going to end this div here just below the first section. So this is the splash image, and I want the splash image to be by itself in its own row. Now below that, we're going to create another row for the next two sections. So we want the vintage bicycle safety film and the charity rides to be sharing the same row. So here on line 30, we'll create another opening for a div with a class of row. And we'll move the closing div here for the row down to line 46, just after the two sections for the safety film and charity rides. And once again, we can give a little comment here in the code that we are closing off that row class. Now in the first row, we have a section here that's holding our splash image. And this one, we would like to give it the class of column-12 because it's spanning 12 of the 12 units of our grid. In the second row, however, here we have two sections, and for the safety film, we would like this one to take up 2/3 of the 12 unit grid. So we're going to give this one a class of column-8. And then the second section here, we would like it to take up the other 1/3 of the 12 unit grid. So this one's going to get a class of column-4. So again, the first section gets a class of column-8. The second section here is getting a class of column-4. So let's go ahead and come back to the browser and refresh. And here you can see the first section, and below it you can see the vintage bicycle safety film is taking up 2/3 with the column-8. And next to that, our charity rides is taking up 1/3 using a column-4. Next, we'll move on to the footer section. Now, just the same as the header at the top of the screen, I want the footer to also have a bar that travels 100% of the screen. And again, in a future exercise, we're going to be adding a nice gradient fade to this particular bar across the screen. But for now, it's just going to be an empty element. And we'll create that bar by creating a div with the class of container-fluid. And we'll move the closing of the container fluid div to the very bottom, just before the closing body element and just after the closing footer element. And here we'll give a comment that this is the closing of the container-fluid class. So same as the header element above, we want the footer to get a class of container so that it will be 980 pixels wide and it will center itself in the middle of this other element. So if we go ahead and save the page and refresh, you can see now the footer is behaving and is centering inside of the container. Now we only want a single row in our footer, so here we'll just create a div with a class of row. And we'll close this div here just before the closing of the footer. And I'll write a comment letting us know that this is the closing of the row class. Now for the sections here, I have 4 sections, which you can see here: correspondence, customer service, get involved, and follow us. Now I'd like each of these to take up 1/4 of my 12 unit grid. 12 divided by 4 is 3, so that lets me know that each of these sections here should get a class of column-3. So we can go ahead and copy this and we can paste it onto the other sections here. So I'm taking extra care to make sure I'm pasting these into the opening section tag and not accidentally put them in the closing section tag. So let's go ahead and save the page and we'll come back to the browser and refresh. And here you can see those column-3s are giving us the 4 columns here in our footer at the bottom of the page. Now one thing you might have noticed is that sometimes content, if it's wider than the column, is actually going to stick out outside of that element. Now a nice way to fix this that also lends itself to creating responsive websites is to tell your content inside of the columns to only be 100% of the column width. So we're going to make this image, in other words, become fluid and shrink its width to match whatever size column it's in. In order to do that, let's bring up the layout.css file that we were working on previously. And underneath our universal selector here that says box sizing, we're going to go down to line 5 and create a new selector. And here I'm going to use a compound selector that will include images. I'm also going to include forms, tables, and iframes. And I'm going to set them all to be width 100%. We're also going to give them a max dash width of 100%. This will ensure that all of these elements will always stay within the confines of the column that they occupy. So we'll go ahead and save layout.css and then you can close out that file. And if we come back to the browser and refresh, you can see now that our image is staying within the confines of our column-12 there. Next, let's jump back to Atom and let's bring up our contact page. Now the header and footer is going to be the same for the contact page as it is for the index page, so we can go ahead and copy and paste that information over. So we'll start off with the container-fluid element here, and we'll stop highlighting just before the main element, and then I'll go ahead and copy that and we'll paste it here onto the contact page to save some time. And we'll go ahead and save that. We'll also change that on the products page as well. And lastly, we'll also change that on the individual products pages, which are in the products folder. And remember, these pages will have to update the links here with .. in front of them again. So we'll just add .. in front of index, .. in front of products, and .. in front of contact.html as well. And then we'll highlight this code for the individual products pages to make it a bit easier. And we'll copy that and we'll update that on 2.html as well as on 3.html. Now the footer, as I mentioned, will also be the same on all of the other pages. So we can grab the footer here, starting with container-fluid and ending down just before the closing body tag. So I'm copying that off the index page and then we'll go ahead and go over to the contact page, and just after the main element there and before the closing body tag, we can paste in our new footer. And we'll do the same here for the products page. Again, just below the main element and just before the closing body element, and we'll paste in that new footer there. And this will be exactly the same on the individual products pages as well. Okay, now that we've updated the header and the footer for all of our pages, I'm going to go back to the contact page and we'll start working on the main element. Now, just the same as on the index page, we want the main element on the contact page to have a class of container to pull it into the center of the page and give it a fixed width. Inside of that, we're just going to have a single row here. For the first section here, we're going to give it a class of column-5. And for the second section here, which is the map, we're going to give it a class of column-7. Let's go ahead and save this page, and we'll come back to the browser and we'll click the contacts link. So here you can see the column-5 for our form and the column-7 here for our map. Next, we'll move on to the products page. Starting with the main section here, it will also get a class of container. And here we'll have a row that is going to surround the vintage bicycles section as well as the quote section just before our H2 here that says our featured picks. So we'll go ahead and close out that row just before our H2 there. Now this first section here is going to get a class of column-8, and the second section here is going to get a class of column-4 instead. Let's go ahead and save the products page, and we'll come back to the browser and click the products link, and here you can see the column-8 and the column-4 for our quote. Underneath the H2 with the class of headline that says our featured picks, we're going to create another row. And this row is going to encompass these two sections here for our featured picks. So we'll create another div with the class of row. And we'll end it here just before the next H2. And here this first section will get a class of column-6. And the other section will also get a class of column-6. So we can go ahead and save our products page and come back to the browser and refresh. And there you can see for our featured picks, the Lime Schwinn is taking up half of our layout and the Italian Army Schwinn is taking up the other half of our layout. Now for the next section, which says all bicycles, we have quite a few products here. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to show about 4 products per row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start grouping each 4 sections into their own row. So here we'll create a div with a class of row. And we'll close the row right after the first 4 sections. Then we'll group the next 4 into their own row. And we'll go ahead and close that row class out just before the H2 that says gear and apparel. So we should have 2 rows with 4 sections inside each. And all of these sections here, in order to take up 1/4 of our 12-unit grid, will all get the class of column-3. Now I'll show you a neat trick you can do with Atom Code Editor. And if you'd like to type the same code on multiple lines at the same time, I'm just going to left mouse click after the letter N and the opening section element. And in order to create multiple cursors here, I'm going to hold the command key and I'm going to click into the next section after the letter N and the next and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. So here I've highlighted just after the letter N in all of the sections, and because I was holding the Command key, it allowed me to click and create a cursor after all of these locations here. Now if I hit the space bar, I'm making a keyboard space after the letter N in all of these locations, and here when I type class, I'm actually writing the text class on each of those cursor lines. And here we'll type column-3, end quote. And we were able to apply that class of column-3 to all of those sections at once. So we'll go ahead and save the page, and then we'll come back to the browser and refresh. And now you can see for all bicycles, we have 2 rows here with 4 products in each row. Lastly, for gear and apparel, we also have 4 remaining products. So we're going to do the same thing to those ones. Under the H2 here that says gear and apparel, we'll create another row. And we'll close this row out just before the closing main element. And again, for each of these sections, here we can click and hold the Command key to click into the opening tag here of each section element. And here we're going to use the class of column-3. And we'll go ahead and save this page, and we'll come back to the browser and refresh. And there under gear and apparel, we can see those 4 products. So that concludes the layout for our products page. So now we have the home page, the products page, and the contact page done. Next, we just need to work on the pages for the individual products. So let's jump over to 1.html. Now here, our main element will get the class of container. Now inside of that, we have a section element. And this one we're going to treat a little bit differently. In this case, I want my section to actually be the row itself. So we're going to give this section a class of row. And inside of it, we've created 2 divs as boxes that are going to divide this into 2 columns, where one will contain the image and table and the other one will contain the product details. So here, this first div that we created previously is going to get a class of column-4, so it takes up 1/3 of the 12-unit grid. And then the next class here for the product details div is going to get a column-8 to take up the remaining 2/3 of that 12-unit grid. So let's go ahead and save this page, and then we'll come back to the browser and refresh. And here you can see the column-4 and the column-8. Next, we just need to apply this same class naming to the other individual product pages. So if we go to 2.html, we'll go to the opening main element, and we'll give this one a class of container. And remember, we're giving the section the class of row. And the first div here is getting a class of column-4. And the second div here for product details is getting a class of column-8. Then we'll go over to 3.html and we'll do the same. So here the main element gets the class of container. The section is getting a class of row. And this first div is getting a class of column-4. And the second div there is getting the class of column-8. So if we save, and then we can come back to our main products page, and if we click the first product, the second product, and the third product here, you can see that they all are appearing with the correct layout.